a few times. I'm not quite sure if everyone is familiar with the ICC. Basically, we're one of the largest business organization worldwide. We represent almost 45 million businesses. And I'm sure, even though if you might not know ICC as an organization, you certainly know a few of our products, for example, the ICC Incoterms or the ICC rules on documentary credits, the UCP 600 are worldwide known and used, especially in trade finance. Please jump to the next slide. So yeah, the topic of today has been mentioned already a few times, not just blockchain, but COVID-19. ICC is very active in digitizing trade since a few years already, but we were quite surprised about the magnitude of requests from our members, and our members are mostly banks and companies active in trade, with requests if we can help them to rapidly digitize trade, or even more rapidly than before. Obviously, that's not something that we can do from today to tomorrow, but it's actually quite interesting how many banks came up with some kind of almost life hacks to digitize their trade business overnight. But the reality is trade is still heavily paper-based, as Emmanuel just showed before. And this is one of the big problem of this crisis as well, because not just many banks sit at home, but also trading companies and companies at large maybe don't have access to the documents. So we have signed an agreement with the World Health Organization to really commit that we actively work towards digitizing trade, and blockchain is maybe one puzzle that can help us in this regard. Next slide, please. Well, this is a document that we have prepared with all our members, which is kind of a roadmap to find a common, I would say, common north of how we see digitizing trade and trade finance evolving and what we can actively do to accelerate it. You see kind of 4 different layers of and priorities that we think are important. The first one is really more about the process. Getting rid of paper is one of the key aspects. Then second one in the middle is actually more like a consequence. We speak since a few years about there's quite a huge access to trade finance gap in the industry. So in particular, SMEs have more and more difficulties to get access to trade finance. And on the one hand, there's a pure access gap, but we also see a digitalization divide or digitization gap. In particular, SMEs maybe don't have the means that large companies have. That's something we want to change. And around the legal environment, there's definitely many hurdles and issues that we need to work on with governments and multinational organizations. And then the last one is also something that has been mentioned a few times already before, standardization and interoperability of the various blockchain networks. And I come back to this in a minute. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We can actually jump to
the next slide.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, we can jump to the next one now.
Is this one, David? Sorry.
Yeah, this one, yeah. So ICC and WTO, we really have quite a few projects that we work together, and one was also the Global Trade and Blockchain Forum that we established, I think 1 year ago. The idea is really to enable a dialogue between companies and organizations on a more global space that are actively interested in promoting blockchain solutions. And so it's kind of a dialogue and exchange platform, but also with an aim to kind of draw lessons and concrete actions out of it. And in our discussions, the topics that came up were always a bit the same, and you see them on the bottom of this slide. And again, as I said, interoperability and standardization is one that we kind of drew out are the most important for us. And maybe we see why in the next slide, please. So yeah, like the questions and issues that came back in this debate are always turning around standardization in blockchain, kind of who is the one drafting, maintaining and operating the standards, but also kind of ensuring that the standards are applied, and also enable the adoption in a relatively fast speed of those standards. And then like the second part of this standardization is like, what's the difference between kind of compulsory standards that we need, data formats, and regulation that Emmanuel mentioned together. And we kind of figured out in trade, and I'm really speaking about trade and trade finance in particular, there was not really a concrete forum that dealt with this kind of issues. At ICC was very active in producing rules for the trade finance industry, but they're more like practice documents. But standardization, that was also pointed out by Emmanuel before, was not really a big topic yet in the trade finance industry. And if we jump to the next slide, please. So that kind of as a consequence and the concrete lesson of this, we at the ICC, we were sitting together with our members, and actually we were quite happy that two of our partners, Singapore government and the Asian Development Bank, they were pretty much aligned with us in the view that there is definitely a need for a body that creates standards for this industry and discusses standards. And so as a result, we came up with a concept that's called the Digital Trade Standards Initiative. We're just about to launch this initiative in Singapore, but it will not just physically be based in Singapore. It should span around the world, really with the aim to create open trade and technology standards to promote interoperability for the trade, but also in particular for the trade finance space. Please jump to the next slide. So what this means in concrete terms, it's still fairly open because, as I said, this initiative is just about to launch. What it's relatively clear is ICC, we see ourselves more as a convener of companies and institutions. So basically, we have a rough ideas, and you see this on the right-hand side, what kind of areas could benefit from standardization in the blockchain space, be it data formats, be it digital identities or protocols. But that's not really a given yet, or like a firm menu of what we want to achieve. The idea is really that kind of the various standard setting bodies that are out there, maybe in various industries, could also be grouped and invited to jointly work with us and collaborate with us, because we don't have the ambition to kind of come to the trade space and just come up with firm standards. That would not work. ICC is really more like a convening body here, and we think it's kind of time to work together on standards, not just create them maybe in different countries.